I don't think I ever really believed everything.
And I realized that quite a few of the things didn't hold water.
The actual religions were man-made from wherever.
God? Who's God? What's God?
I think that skepticism really is the first step.
Scientific zest and zeal for the real world.
That was it. I was an atheist from then on.
Talk about joining religious communities just for the sake of being in a community.
Hi, I'm Rad.
Hi, I'm Susan, and this is our friend Mike, who is here to tell us about his story on his road to atheism. Welcome.
Well, thank you.
Welcome. So, in the beginning, you were raised.
I was actually born in Odessa, Ukraine, which at the time was a part of Soviet Union. So I was an atheist, I suppose, to begin with, though I never really thought much about religion. I came to New York when I was 11, and that's really the first time I've met a lot of religious people, and where I realized that being an atheist wasn't necessarily going to put me in a majority.
Okay. Did your parents have any religion that they went by, or was it because of the Soviet type of...
I'm sorry. I think the last religious person in my family was my great-grandfather, who died a couple of years before I was born. I was actually named after him. Mm-hmm. And he was Jewish, and he actually attended a synagogue in Odessa during the Soviet times. So while they weren't necessarily encouraging of religion, it wasn't always a death sentence or anything like that. So.
Okay, very good. And did you grew up in a neighborhood where they surrounded by basically what kind of people and religious-wise?
When I came to New York, we lived in Flushing, which has, I guess, changed quite a bit since the 80s. But it already had quite a few Asian people. There were obviously a lot of Catholics there because there was a large presence of people from various Latin American countries.
And Greece.
And I think there were probably some Eastern Orthodox people as well. And I'm sure there were Protestants there of various denominations. But I was sort of not really aware of these things. I guess back in the 80s, and maybe it was just me, I really wasn't paying much attention to it.
You never had any religious background or training or anything of that nature when growing up as a child?
Not really. I mean, I did read a lot. Mm-hmm. I guess that was standard in Russian-speaking families. Mm-hmm. And
English, too.
But a lot of the books I was expected to read were from the times when people were more religious. So in order to understand a lot of the references, you kind of have to at least be aware of various religious texts.
And did you have any background and training in science, or did you like science? And if so, did that have an influence on your life as far as decision-making in the road to atheism?
People in my family tended to be engineers or in the medical field. So, yes, I was around it, I suppose, most of my life. When I went to high school, I went to Stuyvesant in New York City. So that was supposed to be a science high school. I suppose it still is.
Science and Bronx High School of Science.
Yes.
Those are two.
Right. Yeah. Brooklyn Tech is the third one.
Brooklyn Tech used to be, and at one time, Erasmus Hall used to be. Right. They were the four in the nation, top. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's very good. Stuyvesant, very good.
And then I got a degree in electrical engineering when I went to Cornell. So does that count as science?
It's
not exactly science.
Not exactly science.
Cornell University is known for one of its famous astronomers.
I actually did get to see Carl Sagan while I was there. Okay. Not a whole lot, but he did run some astronomy seminars that were open to the public, and I did get to sit in the back.
Brooklyn in the house, by the way, for Carl Sagan. Oh, that's good. Very good. And Cornell University is also, is also known for its glassmaking.
I know Corning's pretty close.
It's Corning. I'm sorry, Corning. That's right, Corning. Cornell is not Cornell.
Cornell's the college.
It's college, and it's also.
I'm sure they do deal a lot with various glass issues.
They made the basis for the mirrors, which are used in parabolic mirrors are used for telescopes.
Sure.
So in science, I see you had to do reasoning in technical terms, you had to do
One would
reasoning, and you
suppose,
had
yeah.
suppose, and you have to know formulas, and you have to know angles, et cetera, et cetera. That's part of engineering.
Sure.
What is the influence that you found, or were there any influences as far as your schooling and training, as far as critical thinking is concerned?
Well, I suppose I did have to take a lot of just general science classes, and engineering is obviously, a big part of making sure that things do work, and you can't rely on faith to make sure that things do work. But honestly, like during those times, I never really even thought about religion. The only times I would sort of think about it is I would hear people talk about joining religious communities just for the sake of being in a community. Because Cornell can be a little bit isolating, and especially in difficult programs, people can kind of feel left out occasionally. So some people did seem to feel better being in a religious community.
Did anyone ever try and convert you?
No. No, but I mean, I would simply know people, and they would tell me about their own experiences.
Okay, your background, obviously, you have to do critical thinking in whatever you're designing or whatever you're building, and it just can't go by faith. It has to go by actual, factual information.
Logic.
And logic. You're right, which is deductive reasoning. I'd like to know, you have, when did that road to atheism start for you?
I think it started, I guess, after George W. Bush became president, and I was kind of becoming more aware of various policies that I didn't necessarily agree with.
Right.
So there was more that conservative shift. I mean, I know that not all religions tend to be conservative, but in the United States in the recent, I would say 15, 20 years, you kind of did have that shift. Where
That got a lot of us out of the closet.
Yeah, that evangelical morning prayer before meetings at various schools, universities, and even at the
that's
president's.
been throughout history.
Even in George Bush's office, he even had advisors, and he had that prayer type thing as well, which is controversial.
Yeah.
So I suppose it was, around that time, about 15 years ago, that I kind of started to notice that the political views on the right that I disagreed with tended to coincide with those views of the religious right.
Falwell, good example.
Sure. Although, you know what? I think I should have gotten there earlier. Just, living in New York in the 80s, in the middle of, going to school in Manhattan in the middle of the AIDS crisis. I mean, I should have been more aware of it, but I guess I was just so busy doing other stuff.
You were
I
actually
wasn't really
living
thinking.
in what should be like an ideal future, that kids grow up without religion, they don't talk about it, they don't really need it, they just grow
Next
up.
generation.
And that it's irrelevant. And so you actually were sort of like
Caught in between. Spiritual.
Yeah. And for most of my life, I didn't care what people did in churches, in synagogues and so on. But once, especially when Obama became president, they really, burst out and started, especially women's rights, started, trying to take it away and make us go back to the Bronze Age. And until then, I was fine with, you believe what you want, I don't care. But then they started to try and have a deep impact on the government, and separation of church and state, they want to eradicate it and everything. So yeah, I like you, that's when I joined New York City Atheists.
Right. What's the name of the 700 Club? What's his name? Robertson, when he mentioned about that AIDS was the curse that God put on people because they were homosexual.
Right. I kind of didn't even really know about it. I wasn't really aware of it until much, much later. And then, from today's perspective, that's just kind of horrifying.
It is horrifying, and it's isolating, and it really puts a lot of pressure on people, business organizations, as well as the church. Any incidents happen where you might have brought up your feelings as far as being an atheist is concerned in your life, whether it's on a job or not on a job, but let's say friends, relatives, neighbors?
I think there just maybe like more conflicts in terms of some people being more religious than others that you know. I don't think anyone was ever terribly disrespectful of me not being religious, but I think conflicts kind of arose during certain ceremonies. One thing about me is that I just can't stand ceremonies in general. But like, for example, if I had to attend people's weddings and there would be a rabbi there, the rabbi would say something I wouldn't particularly agree with. You can sort of ignore it, but just like that whole situation wasn't particularly happy. Or funerals, kind of like I didn't really like the fact that a lot of people who weren't necessarily religious, and then they die, and then everybody comes together, and then there's a rabbi saying stuff that,
And you would suffer from internal consternation.
Yeah.
Due to the listening to that and saying,
Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, ensure uncertain hope of the resurrection, and all that, and sort of go, okay.
Did you have any type of dealing with anybody who was religious where you happened to voice your opinion? And if you did, what did you say?
Oh, sure. I mean, I'm very upfront about it. So, and I do know people who are religious, and just being upfront about it really, I think that avoids a conflict. People know who I am. They're not trying to influence me. They'll tell me about their experiences. And, it's like I know people who are even evangelical, and who actually, I know some people who are evangelical who are terrific people, are really, really nice.
Yes.
And, they do their own thing, and they talk about their world and what's important to them. And I'll talk about what's important to me. Sure, we're on very different ends of the political spectrum, but I don't think that necessarily means that we have to have a personal conflict.
Okay. You mentioned that you do speak your mind, and that's important. And you did come from Ukraine, or when you were a child, you come from a different perspective. And that perspective, to me, is very important, because when you look and you follow the Constitution of the United States, and you listen to all of the hash and all the other stuff that's given out there, where they're trying to, and you understand, it may not say literally a separation of church and state, but if you see there's nothing religious mentioned in the Constitution, and then when you hear people how they have their viewpoints, whether evangelical or for whatever religious persuasion, it probably turns you the other way when you see that and you're trying to be honest and upfront and you know the Constitution. Probably, a lot of people from out who come to the United States know about the Constitution better than those who are actually born in that. Did that ever influence or come as far as an experience to you?
Well, to be honest, I'm not really a constitutional scholar. I mean, I've tried to read it.
Yes.
So I'm aware of, most of the articles in the Constitution. I sure know about the
First
10 amendments.
Right.
And I know about a few amendments other than the first 10. Couldn't necessarily recite them all right away. But honestly, I think a lot of people from the right know that as well. So they tend to interpret it their own way.
Yeah, well, that's true.
So-
Or they're told how to interpret it.
Right, they interpret it their own way.
Their preacher tells them this is what the Constitution says, and they're not about to go check it. And
honestly, a lot of the religious people I know actually are very well educated. So they certainly know how to read. And I think they do hold to their opinions because there is actually diversity of opinions, even on the religious right. So they do argue with each other. So they, I think in some instances, they know more about the specifics of the various articles or amendments and how they've been interpreted over the years, because that's important as well. So,
well, that's interesting. The Pew Research has shown that those people are very knowledgeable about things such as the Bible, for example. Those who are atheists, the Jews, and Mormons, in that order.
yes, we're the ones. I take these quizzes online, and I always
right.
get 100%.
So I would think that might carry over with having to have knowledge to back up that thought as far as knowledge is concerned, the law and the Constitution, because we're very curious about it.
I learned about it in school, but school was several decades ago, and, because it's not part of my everyday life. So until recently, I forgot about it. It's something that and
That's right.
you don't need to know.
right.
and until they started trying to tear it apart or try to misinterpret it, yes. And or try and, I mean, somebody in the South wants to take away women's rights to vote because we don't vote right.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, speaking of my perspective being a little bit different, I think what people do talk to me about, knowing that I was born in the Soviet Union, is that the Soviet Union really did have a reputation for treating religious people badly. And that is true. Yeah. And that's something that...
Today I'm going to talk about the connection between religion and politics, and perhaps offer some thoughts about how we can sort through some of the often bitter arguments that we've been seeing over the last several years. But it won't have an impact unless we tackle head-on the mutual suspicion that sometimes exists between religious America and secular America. I want to give you an example. During the 2004 U.S. Senate election, in the general election, I ran against a gentleman named Alan Keyes. And my opponent, Alan Keyes, was well-versed in the Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson style of rhetoric, a rhetoric that sometimes labels progressives as both immoral and godless. And in fact, towards the end of the campaign, Mr. Keyes announced to the people of Illinois that, quote, Jesus Christ would not vote for Barack Obama. He claimed to know certain truths. Obama says he's a Christian, he was saying, and yet he supports a lifestyle that the Bible calls an abomination. Mr. Obama says he's a Christian, but he supports the destruction of innocent and sacred life. So Mr. Keyes would say. And what would my supporters have me say? How might I respond? I said that we live in a pluralistic society, that I can't impose my own religious views on another. I informed Mr. Keyes that I was running to be the United States Senator of Illinois and not the Minister of Illinois. And my dilemma is by no means unique. In a way, it reflects the broader debate that we've been having in this country for the last 30 years over the role of religion in politics. For some time now, there's been plenty of talk among pundits and pollsters that the political divide in this country has fallen sharply along religious lines. In fact, the single biggest gap in party affiliation among white Americans today is not between men and women, or those who reside in so-called red states and those who reside in blue, but between those who attend church regularly and those who don't. Conservative leaders have been all too happy to exploit this gap, consistently reminding evangelical Christians that Democrats disrespect their values and dislike their church. At best, we may try to avoid the conversation about religion altogether, fearful of offending anyone and claiming that regardless of our personal beliefs, constitutional principles tie our hands. I think it's time that we join a serious debate about how to reconcile faith with our modern pluralistic society. Substantially more people in America believe in angels than they do in evolution. I was not raised in a particularly religious household, as undoubtedly many in the audience were. My father, who returned to Kenya when I was just 2, was born a Muslim, but as an adult was an atheist. My mother, whose parents were non-practicing Baptists and Methodists, but she grew up with a healthy skepticism of organized religion herself, partly because of the hypocrisy that she had seen in the church early in her life. And because she grew up with a healthy skepticism of organized religion, so did I. Those with the most insular views of faith are those who cynically use religion to justify partisan ends. In other words, if we don't reach out to evangelical Christians and other religious Americans and tell them what we stand for, then Jerry Falwell's and Pat Robertson's and Alan Keyes's views will continue to hold sway. I believe in vigorous enforcement of our non-discrimination laws. I think we should put more of our tax dollars into educating our poor girls and boys. I also think that we should give them information about contraception that can prevent unwanted pregnancies and lower abortion rates and help assure that every child is loved and cherished. In fact, because I do not believe that religious people have a monopoly on morality, I would rather have someone who is grounded in morality and ethics and who is also secular affirm their morality and their ethics and their values without pretending that there's something they're not. They don't need to do that. None of us need to do that. I want to talk a little bit about what conservative leaders also need to do. Some truths they need to acknowledge. For one thing, they need to understand the critical role of the separation of church and state in not just preserving our democracy, but the robustness of our religious practice. And moreover, given the increasing diversity of America's populations, the dangers of sectarianism are greater than ever. Whatever we once were, we are no longer a Christian nation, at least not just. We are also a Jewish nation, a Muslim nation, and a Buddhist nation, and a Hindu nation, and a nation of non-believers. And even if we did have only Christians in our midst, if we expelled every non-Christian from the United States of America, whose Christianity would we teach in the schools? Would it be James Dobson's or Al Sharpton's? Which passages of Scripture should guide our public policy? Should we go with Leviticus, which suggests slavery is okay, and that eating shellfish is an abomination? Or we could go with Deuteronomy, which suggests stoning your child if he strays from the faith? Or should we just stick to the Sermon on the Mount, a passage that is so radical that it's doubtful that our own Defense Department would survive its application? Which brings me to my second point. Democracy demands that the religiously motivated translate their concerns into universal rather than religion-specific values. What do I mean by this? It requires that their proposals be subject to argument and amenable to reason. Now, I may be opposed to abortion for religious reasons, to take one example, but if I seek to pass a law banning the practice, I can't simply point to the teachings of my church or evoke God's will. I have to explain why abortion violates some principle that is accessible to people of all faiths, including those with no faith at all. Now, this is going to be difficult for some who believe in the inerrancy of the Bible, as many evangelicals do. But in a pluralistic society, we have no choice. Politics depends on our ability to persuade each other of common aims based on a common reality. It involves compromise, the art of what's possible. And at some fundamental level, religion doesn't allow for compromise. It's the art of the impossible. If God's spoken, then followers are expected to live up to God's edicts, regardless of the consequences. Now, to base one's own life on such uncompromising commitments may be sublime, but to base our policy making on such commitments would be a dangerous thing. And if you doubt that, let me just give you an example. We all know the story of Abraham and Isaac. Abraham's ordered by God to offer up his only son. Without argument, he takes Isaac up to the mountaintop, he binds them to the altar, raises his knife, prepares to act as God commanded. But it's fair to say that if any of us leaving this church saw Abraham on the roof of a building raising his knife, we would, at the very least, call the police and expect the Department of Children and Family Services to take Isaac away from Abraham. And so the best we can do is act in accordance with those things that we all see and that we all hear, be it common laws or basic reason. Even those who claim the Bible's inerrancy make distinctions between scriptural edicts and may be modified to accommodate for modern life. And the American people intuitively understand this, which is why the majority of Catholics practice birth control. And some of those opposed to gay marriage, nevertheless, are opposed to a constitutional amendment to ban it. So we have some work to do here. But I am hopeful that we can bridge the gap that exists and overcome the prejudices that all of us, to one degree or another, bring. No matter how religious they may be or may not be, people are tired of seeing faith used as a tool of attack. They don't want faith used to belittle or to divide. They are tired of people who deliver more screed than sermon. So let me end with just one other interaction I had during my campaign. A few days after I won the Democratic nomination in my U.S. Senate race, I get this email from a doctor at the University of Chicago Medical School, and the email said the following, quote, "Congratulations on your overwhelming and inspiring primary win. I was happy to vote for you, and I will tell you that I am seriously considering voting for you in the general election."